A stark reminder today that the constitutional protections we have long assumed would always protect us because they were bedrock principles of our very democracy are to Donald Trump nothing more than stumbling blocks as Trump and his cabinet seek to pursue an agenda by any means necessary. Alarming brand new reporting from New York Times reporters Jonathan Swan and Maggie Haberman for their new book, Regime Change, finds that Donald Trump and his administration actually went further than anyone knew at the time and previously realized or reported in seeking to upend constitutional protections, specifically suspending the rights of habeas corpus and invoking the Insurrection Act. All of it was in service of furthering Donald Trump's mass deportation agenda and stifling any constitutionally protected dissent against that agenda. That push by Stephen Miller and other key administration figures to suspend habeas corpus, the constitutional right to be brought before a judge and have your detention justified, and by J.D. Vance to invoke the Insurrection Act, which would have allowed Donald Trump to deploy troops on the streets of American cities. Those twin efforts were so concerning that even conservative legal people working inside this White House of Trump 2.0 saw it necessary to vehemently push back. The New York Times journalists report this, quote, "Last spring, Will Scharf, an arch-conservative lawyer serving as the White House staff secretary, wrote a secret memo to the chief of staff that reflected growing unease in the West Wing about one of the extreme measures being weighed by Stephen Miller, the powerful advisor driving Trump's deportation campaign. The Constitution," Mr. Scharf wrote in his memo to Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, "permits suspension of habeas corpus only in cases of rebellion or invasion. Courts have almost uniformly held that only Congress can do it. Suspending habeas corpus was one of the two radical ideas Mr. Miller had been pushing that alarmed Mr. Scharf. The other was invoking the Insurrection Act to deploy the military to enforce the law on American streets as protests grew against deportation sweeps. The debate over invoking the Insurrection Act came to a head in January after ICE agents killed two American citizens, Alex Preddy and Renee Good. They had been protesting ICE action in Minnesota. At that, the Times writes this, quote, "A few days after the Preddy killing, Vance walked into Ms. Wiles' West Wing office. Vance got to the point. They needed to invoke the Insurrection Act swiftly to crush the unrest in Minnesota. It would be painful in the short term," he said, "but the message it would send would make sure no one tried it again." While the White House ultimately did not move forward, the Times cautions that the desire to unleash troops on the streets of American cities is still alive and well. The journalists write this, quote, "Yet just as the idea of suspending habeas corpus was set aside but never fully abandoned by some inside the White House, the Insurrection Act, at least in the eyes of its proponents, would remain a loaded weapon in a West Wing eager to test the limits of presidential power." We're back with Glenn, Melissa, and Liz. Glenn, these are your colleagues, Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan. Your thoughts on this reporting?
Well, what's really interesting about this, I'll kind of flip it a bit on its head. I think, there was some sense that we knew that Miller was pushing for these maximalist objectives. What is very interesting to me is even in a Trump 2 White House with no guardrails, this died a quiet death. And I think that reflects a couple of realities. I think first, I would point to, and again, this is not necessarily included in the reporting, but there is a strong countercurrent within the West Wing, including David Warrington, who's the White House counsel, of a kind of a libertarian streak. And I think Miller's push, First Through America First Legal, this Trump nonprofit that has been really the storehouse for these ideas, has left some people in the Trump coalition, even some inside the White House, feeling profoundly uncomfortable. That's number one. And number two, as you said, Nicole, the political realities on the street have been catastrophic. And this really, I think, the question is, did this period of time reflect kind of a high watermark in terms of Miller's audacity and the extension of executive power? Or is what we are witnessing now a lull in that, that, to accommodate the backlash and the midterm elections, and we're going to see something of a renewal of that, a clash between the executive and the legislative later on. We just can't tell. But what it really shows, I think, is the tensions, even within the White House, of what Miller and by extension, what Trump really want to accomplish.
I mean, Melissa, I guess I'll flip it back over. And this person, I'd never heard of him before, but Mr. Scharf writes a memo because he views the Constitution as the only legal argument that will stop this radical, unconstitutional, extreme conduct on the part of two of Trump's most influential advisors. And I guess my question is, does that lawyer who stopped these things survive the book?
Who knows? I mean, I think there's so many interesting things in this reporting. One, the idea that this very conservative lawyer who has been part of the administration and maybe blessed other policies thought that this was a line in the sand. This was a bridge too far. To be very clear, the writ of habeas corpus dates all the way back to England and the Magna Carta. This was viewed as one of the fundamental rights of the people, that you cannot just be thrown in jail without the government explaining why it has done so and justifying it. We've had presidents push the envelope on this. They've genuinely been rebuked in most cases, either by Congress or the courts. And this is the history that Will Scharf invokes in this memo that he writes for Susie Wiles. The idea that Susie Wiles is the thing standing between us and a legitimate constitutional crisis is genuinely frightening. I mean, like, one person is standing between us and a president who believes he has almost unchecked power and who is facilitated by individuals who are senior members of the staff who are, encouraging it in some capacity or would like to see him take this on. So this, to me, is just an alarming memo. Like, it may have been a path not taken, but the fact that we have people considering this, given the case law on this, given the very clear history regarding the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, the fact that Congress is unlikely to defend its prerogative to invoke the writ of habeas corpus and to suspend the writ of habeas corpus here over the president's encroachment on that power. All of this, to me, is just incredibly alarming. Like, we literally owe it to Susie Wiles that we are not in a legitimate constitutional crisis over the writ of habeas corpus.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, Liz, the other lens would be if Democrats were to do what all of the polls available suggest they will do, and that is retake control of the House and potentially the Senate. I would imagine one of the first people you'd want to talk to is this lawyer who wrote the memo. If you want to look at the mass deportation program, if you want to look at the efforts to deny people their rights before they were deported, if you want to examine that, it seems like you have some real breadcrumbs here.
Well, there's actually quite a bit that Congress could do here. Part of the problem with the Insurrection Act and a lot of these authorities that the president could, in theory, invoke in emergency situations is that they were written into law centuries ago, very outdated, and they really are due for updating. Congress should take a hard look at the law around habeas corpus, the Insurrection Act, invoking the National Guard, all of these emergency authorities that Trump has contemplated using and has, in some cases with the National Guard, used, are things that Congress needs to review and rein in so that they are not susceptible to this type of abuse in the future. What we see from this memo is the extent to which the White House is exploring the potential to expand its power without really consulting or working with the lawyers, the people in the Justice Department who are entrusted with implementing the policy of the executive branch. This was under Pam Bondi's leadership. I think the Scharf memo shows that Bondi was really sort of an empty vessel and was being pushed down directions from Stephen Miller and co. in the White House and not really having the opportunity to weigh in from a legal perspective, which is not at all how the justice system or the legal system is supposed to work. And we really need Congress to step up and do its oversight of the Justice Department and look at some of these older laws that are due for